I was not supposed to be standing in that hall. Let me make that absolutely clear. I was not a candidate. I was not a suitor. I was not some lovesick fool who had crossed 3 star systems to kneel before a queen I had never met. I was a military attaché assigned to a diplomatic outpost on a planet where my species was barely tolerated, and the only reason I was inside the great choosing hall of Sithari Prime was because my ambassador needed someone to take notes. That was it. Notes. But the universe has a way of making plans for people who think they are invisible, and on that day, in that hall, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the known galaxy, I made the mistake of being noticed. My name is Dax Corwin, Lieutenant Commander, United Earth Defense Corps, attached to the Human Embassy on Sithari Prime, as a security liaison and cultural observer. Those titles sound impressive, until you realize the entire embassy staff was 11 people. Our building was a converted storage facility on the edge of the capital district, and my budget for the entire fiscal year would not have covered the catering bill for the event I was currently attending. The Great Choosing Hall was the most spectacular structure I had ever seen. It was alive, not metaphorically. The walls were grown from bioluminescent coral that pulsed with slow waves of blue and gold light, and the ceiling arched 200 feet above my head like the inside of a cathedral, designed by something that had never heard the word modest. The floor was polished chitin, smooth as glass, and warm under my boots. Every surface hummed with a faint vibration, as if the building itself had a heartbeat. And it was packed. Over 4,000 beings filled the tiered galleries that ringed the central floor. I counted representatives from at least 40 species, each delegation dressed in their finest, each one radiating wealth and power and centuries of political influence. The air smelled like ozone and something floral I could not identify, and the sound was a constant low roar of conversation in dozens of languages, all of it being processed through my translation implant so fast it gave me a headache. The candidates stood on the central floor. There were 63 of them arranged in a wide crescent facing the empty throne at the far end of the hall. These were the finest males their civilizations had to offer, the cream of the galaxy, and every single one of them made me feel like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. The Drashan contingent dominated the left side of the crescent. Their candidate, Prince Vorthek, stood nearly 8 feet tall, his exoskeleton gleaming like polished obsidian, his 4 arms folded across a chest wider than a doorframe. The Drashan Empire was the second largest military power in the quadrant, and Vorthek looked like he had been specifically engineered to remind everyone of that fact. His eyes, 6 of them arranged in 2 rows of 3, swept the hall with the lazy confidence of something that had never lost a fight. The Solmari delegation occupied the center. Their candidate was the opposite of Vorthek in every visible way. Tall and slender, draped in robes woven from actual captured light, his skin shifting through shades of silver and pearl with every breath. Prince Aelindor of the Third Luminance was said to be the most brilliant diplomatic mind in 3 sectors, and he carried himself with the serene composure of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome of the selection and found them all acceptable. The Gorvathi hegemony had sent Warlord Kravith. He was enormous, nearly as large as Vorthek, but built like a siege engine, his ceremonial armor covered in the engraved names of enemies he had personally defeated in combat. The list covered every visible surface of the armor. There were a lot of names. And then there was me, standing at the far right end of the crescent, wearing a dress uniform I had borrowed from the embassy supply closet because my actual uniform had a coffee stain on it, holding a datapad I was supposed to be taking notes on, wondering exactly how my life had arrived at this particular moment. I was not on the floor as a candidate. I want to be clear about that. I was standing near the edge because Ambassador Diane Prescott had told me to get as close to the ceremony as possible so my report would have first-hand detail. She wanted to know who said what, who looked at whom, which delegations seemed to be forming alliances. Standard diplomatic intelligence work. I was a pair of eyes with a notepad, nothing more. The problem was where I was standing. The floor protocol for the choosing ceremony was ancient and precise. Candidates stood in the crescent. Observers stood in the galleries. There was no in-between, but I did not know that. Because the cultural briefing packet I had been given was 3 years out of date, and had been translated from Velari to Solmari to Standard English by someone who apparently did not consider floor positioning important enough to mention. So there I was, on the candidate floor, in the crescent line, looking like I belonged there even though I absolutely did not. And then the horns sounded. They were not horns in any human sense of the word. They were living creatures, mounted in alcoves high on the walls, and when they opened their mouths, the sound that came out was a single sustained note, so deep and so powerful, I felt it in my teeth. The entire hall went silent. 4,000 beings stopped talking at exactly the same instant, and the quiet that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The throne was no longer empty. Queen Salith of the Velari Dominion did not walk into rooms. She manifested. One moment the throne was vacant, and the next she was there, as if reality had simply rearranged itself to accommodate her presence. She was 7 feet tall, and armored in living chitin that shimmered through shades of bronze and copper and dark gold with every slight movement. Her form was both alien and strangely elegant, her limbs longer than a human's, her movements fluid in a way that suggested tremendous controlled power. She had 4 eyes, 2 large and 2 smaller, and they burned with a molten amber light that seemed to cast actual shadows in the space around her face. She was, without question, the most commanding being I had ever seen in my life, and I had served under some terrifying commanders. The entire hall knelt. Every candidate, every observer, every delegate. 4,000 beings dropped to one knee, in a wave that rolled outward from the throne like a shockwave. I did not kneel. It was not defiance. It was not courage. It was ignorance. Pure, embarrassing, completely avoidable ignorance. The cultural briefing packet had not mentioned the kneeling. The translated protocols had not mentioned the kneeling, and by the time I realized that every single being in the hall was on one knee, and I was the only creature still standing, it was too late to do anything about it without making the moment worse. So I stood there, one human, upright, in a sea of kneeling giants. I could feel the stares. They hit me like physical pressure, thousands of eyes from dozens of species, all locking onto the one thing in the hall that was different. The whispers started immediately, a rushing sound like wind through dry grass, and my translator fed me fragments. Who is that? What species? Is that a human? Why is it standing? Does it not know? Is it challenging the queen? I was not challenging anyone. I was trying very hard not to throw up from sheer panic. And then Queen Salith looked at me. Her 4 amber eyes found me across the width of that enormous hall, with a precision that made me certain she had been aware of me from the moment she appeared. The weight of her gaze was extraordinary. It was not hostile. It was not warm. It was the gaze of something ancient and intelligent, and utterly unreadable, examining a creature it had not expected to find. The moment stretched. 2 seconds. 5. 10. Every being in the hall was watching the queen watch me, and the silence had taken on a quality that made the air feel thick. Then her mandibles clicked once, a sharp, precise sound, and my translator processed it with a half-second delay. Interesting. That was all. One word. Then she turned her attention to the full crescent of candidates, and I remembered how to breathe. The ceremony began. A Velari high priest emerged from behind the throne and began speaking in formal court dialect, his voice amplified by the living acoustics of the hall. He spoke of tradition, of the sacred duty of selection, of the bond between queen and consort that formed the foundation of the Dominion's strength. He spoke for a long time. I was too shaken to take notes. Then he said something that changed everything. The trials. Queen Salith had chosen to invoke the ancient selection trials, a series of tests that had not been used in over 300 years. Under this format, every candidate would be evaluated across multiple challenges before the queen made her final choice. The hall reacted with a murmur of surprise that bordered on excitement. This was historic. This was unprecedented in living memory. Then the high priest said the part that made my blood freeze. By the ancient laws governing the trials, every species with a representative present on the candidate floor was required to put forward a formal contestant. Refusal was considered a grave insult to the Velari crown, punishable by immediate severance of all diplomatic relations. Every species on the candidate floor, including the one idiot human standing at the end of the crescent who was only there because he did not read the floor protocol. The High Priest's eyes found me. Queen Salith's eyes found me. 4,000 pairs of eyes found me. Prince Vorthek of the Drashan Empire looked at me and made a sound that my translator rendered as laughter. Warlord Kravith of the Gorvathi hegemony did not even bother to look at me. I was beneath his notice. Prince Aelendor of the Solmari Luminance glanced at me with an expression I could only describe as pity. And I stood there, in my borrowed uniform with the slightly crooked collar, holding a datapad full of notes I had not taken, realizing that I had just accidentally entered myself into a competition for the hand of the most powerful queen in the known galaxy. My translator buzzed with an incoming message from Ambassador Prescott in the gallery above. Her words were very simple and very clear. What have you done? I did not have a good answer for that. I did not have any answer at all. All I had was the echo of that single word still ringing through my mind. The click of mandibles from a queen who ruled 1,000 worlds. Interesting. She had called me interesting. And in a hall full of princes, warlords, and philosopher kings, I had a terrible feeling that interesting was the most dangerous thing a human could be. The emergency meeting at the embassy lasted 4 hours. Ambassador Prescott paced back and forth across the conference room so many times I thought she was going to wear a groove in the floor. Her face had been locked in the same expression since the ceremony ended, a combination of disbelief and controlled fury that I had previously only seen on drill instructors who had caught recruits doing something spectacularly stupid. I sat at the table and did not speak unless spoken to. That seemed wise. The situation was straightforward in its awfulness. I had been standing on the candidate floor during the invocation of the trials. Under Velari law, that made me a declared candidate. Withdrawal required a formal renunciation before the full court, which under the ancient trial protocols was classified as an insult to the Queen's honor. An insult to the Queen's honor triggered an automatic review of all diplomatic agreements between the offending species and the Dominion. Humanity had exactly 3 diplomatic agreements with the Velari Dominion. A trade compact that gave us access to their jump gate network, a non-aggression treaty that kept their border fleets from wandering into our space, and a cultural exchange program that was the only reason our embassy existed in the first place. If I withdrew, all 3 went under review. If even one was suspended, humanity lost access to the jump gate network, which was currently our only reliable connection to 17 of our colony worlds. So I could not withdraw. Ambassador Prescott stopped pacing and looked at me with eyes that could have cut steel. She told me the strategy was simple. I would compete in the trials. I would not win. I would place somewhere in the middle of the pack, demonstrate basic competence without threatening any of the serious candidates, and bow out gracefully when eliminated. The goal was survival. Not victory, survival. I told her I understood. She told me that if I embarrassed humanity, she would personally ensure I spent the rest of my military career cataloging mineral samples on an asteroid no one had bothered to name. I told her I understood that too. The first trial was announced for the following morning, the trial of lineage. Each candidate would present their bloodline, their civilization's achievements, and their personal qualifications before the full court. It was, essentially, a resume presentation on a galactic stage. I spent the night in my quarters at the embassy, reviewing everything I could find about the other candidates. The more I read, the worse I felt. Prince Vorthek's lineage traced back 12,000 years through an unbroken chain of warrior kings. His family had conquered 6 star systems and held them through 47 generations. He personally held military commendations from 9 separate campaigns and had been genetically enhanced at birth with the finest modifications the Drashan Empire could produce. Prince Aelendor's dynasty had produced more philosophers, scientists, and diplomats than any other family in Solmari history. He spoke 41 languages fluently, held advanced degrees in xenopolitics and temporal mathematics, and had brokered peace agreements between species that had been at war for centuries. Warlord Kravith had killed his first enemy in personal combat at the age of what translated roughly to 14. He commanded a fleet of 200 warships. His personal wealth exceeded the gross domestic product of most planetary civilizations. And then there was me, Dax Corwin, born on a farming colony in the outer settlements. Parents were agricultural engineers. No noble blood, no ancient dynasty, no genetic enhancements. I joined the military at 16 after our colony was raided, and I fought my way out of a burning storage building with a piece of sharpened hull plating, because it was the only thing within reach. That was my lineage, a farm boy with a sharp piece of metal. The morning came too fast. I put on my borrowed uniform, straightened the collar as best I could, and walked into the great choosing hall for the trial of lineage. The format was simple. Each candidate stepped into the center of the floor, faced the throne, and presented their case. The Queen listened without reaction. The court listened and reacted plenty. Prince Vorthek went first. He spoke for 20 minutes about his bloodline, his conquests, and the unmatched military power of the Drashan Empire. His voice filled the hall like a war drum, and when he finished, the Drashan delegation erupted in rhythmic stomping that shook the floor. Prince Aelendor followed. His presentation was elegant, measured, and brilliant. He did not boast. He simply laid out a history of intellectual and diplomatic achievement so vast and so accomplished that boasting would have been redundant. The Solmari delegation responded with a harmonic chant that resonated through the bioluminescent walls. Warlord Kravith was brief. He listed his kills, his conquests, and his wealth. He did not embellish. He did not need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Candidate after candidate took the floor. The Kasari envoy presented a genetic lineage optimized across 2,000 generations. The Thelvani representative recited a dynasty of psychic warriors whose mental abilities bordered on mythical. Each presentation was more impressive than the last. Each one, another mountain stacked on top of the already impossible landscape I was expected to navigate. Then it was my turn. I walked to the center of the floor. The hall was so quiet I could hear the coral walls breathing. 4,000 beings watched me with expressions ranging from amusement to contempt, to genuine curiosity about what possible thing I could say that would justify my presence. I looked up at Queen Salith on her throne. Her 4 amber eyes watched me with that same unreadable intensity from the day before. I told the truth. I said that my species had discovered faster than light travel 14 years ago. I said that we had no ancient dynasties, no 1,000-year empires, no legendary bloodlines. I said that my family were farmers who grew food in the dirt of a colony world that most star charts did not bother to label. I said that when I was 16 years old, raiders attacked our colony. They came in the night and they burned everything. I was in a storage shed when the attack started, and the only weapon I could find was a piece of hull plating that had broken off a damaged shuttle. I sharpened it against the concrete floor, and I used it to fight my way through the dark to reach my family. I said that I did not have a noble lineage. I had calluses and scars and a military service record that nobody in this hall would consider impressive. The only thing I could present to this court was the fact that I was still alive, which meant that everything the galaxy had thrown at me so far had not been enough to put me down. Then I stopped talking and walked back to my position. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the laughter started. It came from the Gorvathi delegation first, a deep rumbling sound like grinding stone, and it spread through the hall in waves. The Drashan contingent joined in, then the Kasari, then a dozen other delegations, 4,000 beings laughing at the human who thought a piece of scrap metal was a lineage. I stood in my position and kept my eyes forward and let them laugh. There was nothing else I could do. But I noticed one being who was not laughing. Queen Salith sat on her throne, motionless, her 4 eyes fixed on me with an expression that had changed. I could not read it. I did not know Velari expressions well enough to decode what I was seeing, but the laughter did not seem to touch her. She leaned forward on her throne, just slightly, just enough that the candidates nearest to her noticed, and the laughter in their sections died immediately. The trial of lineage concluded with no eliminations. It was an evaluation round, not a combat round. I had survived it. That afternoon, the second trial was announced. The trial of strength. Each candidate would enter a sealed arena, and face a Velari warbeast in single combat. The creatures were called HFY, bioengineered predators that the Velari had developed centuries ago as living weapons. 6 legs, acid-laced fangs, armored hide, and a predatory intelligence that made them significantly more dangerous than anything that size had a right to be. Most candidates would use their personal weapons: energy lances, plasma blades, powered exoskeletal armor, graviton gauntlets. The technology on display would be extraordinary. I went to the embassy armory and looked at what we had. Lieutenant Perry Grant, our supply officer, stood next to me as I surveyed the inventory. It did not take long. Humanity's embassy on Cithari Prime had a budget that would make a school fundraiser look generous. Our armory contained 6 standard sidearms, 2 rifles, a box of flares, and a combat knife. Perry asked me if I wanted to requisition something from the military outpost in the next system. A shuttle could make the trip in 18 hours. The trial was in 6. I picked up the combat knife. It was a good knife. 8 inches of hardened steel, balanced for throwing, sharp enough to split a hair. It was not a plasma lance. It was not a graviton gauntlet. But it was what I had, and a long time ago in a burning storage shed, I had learned that what you have is what you fight with. The arena was a circular pit carved into the bedrock beneath the choosing hall, ringed by observation galleries where the full court watched from above. The floor was raw stone, uneven, and scattered with obstacles that might have been natural formations or might have been deliberately placed to make the fight more interesting. A shimmer of energy containment fields sealed the space. The candidates went in one at a time. Prince Vorthek entered, with a plasma lance the size of a small tree, and killed his HFY in under 8 seconds. The creature barely had time to charge before he put a bolt of superheated plasma through its central nervous cluster. The Drashan delegation roared approval. Prince Aelendor used a device I could not identify that seemed to disrupt the creature's neural pathways. It collapsed without being touched, unconscious and twitching, elegant, clinical. The Solmari delegation nodded with restrained satisfaction. Warlord Kraveth did not use a weapon at all. He walked into the arena, waited for the HFY to charge him, caught it by the throat with both hands, and broke its neck with a single twist. The Gorvathi delegation went silent for a moment, then erupted in a chant that rattled the gallery railings. Several candidates were injured. 2 were eliminated when they were unable to subdue their beasts within the time limit. 1 was carried out on a medical stretcher, badly mauled, his candidacy over. Then my name was called. I walked into the arena with my knife. The gallery above me buzzed with confusion. Several delegates pointed at my hand and spoke to each other, in tones that my translator rendered as disbelief. A Drashan observer said something that translated roughly to, "Is that a cutting utensil?" The containment field sealed behind me. The opposite wall opened, and the HFY came out. It was bigger than I expected, about the size of a large horse, but lower to the ground, built for speed and aggression. 6 legs moved in a fluid, insectoid rhythm that covered ground with alarming speed. Its hide was layered plates of dark natural armor, and its mouth was a nightmare of interlocking fangs that glistened with something wet and chemical. It saw me, and charged immediately. No hesitation, no circling, just a straight, explosive sprint across the arena floor. I moved. I had fought predators before, not alien ones, but Earth had no shortage of things that wanted to eat you on colony worlds that had been hastily terraformed with imported ecosystems. The principle was the same. Do not be where the teeth are. Use the terrain. Make the animal work harder than you. The HFY was fast, but it was built for straight-line pursuit. It did not corner well. I threw myself sideways behind a stone formation and felt the creature's body slam into the rock hard enough to crack it. Acid-laced saliva sprayed across the surface, and the stone began to smoke. I rolled to my feet and moved again. The creature recovered faster than I liked and came at me from a different angle, its 6 legs giving it lateral mobility I had underestimated. One of its forelimbs caught my left shoulder and raked 3 deep lines through my uniform and into the skin beneath. The pain was immediate and bright, but pain was something I had a lot of experience with. I got inside its reach. That was the key. The HFY's weapons were in its mouth and on the ends of its limbs. Between those points, there was a gap. I pressed against its flank, too close for it to bite, and drove my knife into the gap between two armor plates, just behind its forward left leg. The creature screamed. The sound was not something my translator could process. It thrashed sideways and threw me across the arena. I hit the ground hard, lost the knife, and tasted blood. 4 minutes. That is how long the fight lasted. 4 minutes of the most brutal, desperate, close-quarters combat I had ever experienced. I retrieved my knife twice. I was thrown 3 times. The HFY opened gashes on my shoulder, my ribs, and my left forearm that would need serious medical attention. But I learned it. I learned its patterns, its recovery time, the slight delay between its lunge and its retreat. And on my third close engagement, I found what I was looking for. The neural cluster at the base of its skull, behind the heaviest armor plating, accessible only from a specific angle when the creature lowered its head for a strike. I let it charge me one final time. I waited until the last possible moment, stepped sideways, and drove the knife upward through the gap in the skull plates, into the neural cluster beneath. The HFY dropped. It slid across the stone floor and came to rest against the arena wall, motionless. I stood in the center of the arena, bleeding from 3 wounds, holding a knife that was now slick with fluid that was not entirely mine. The gallery above me was silent. Then, slowly, scattered applause began. It was not enthusiastic. It was not celebratory. It was the reluctant acknowledgement of something unexpected. The human had not died. The human had won. And he had done it with a piece of sharpened metal, because that was all he had. I walked out of the arena under my own power, which felt important. The embassy medical officer met me in the corridor and began treating my wounds immediately. She was not gentle about it. She told me I was an idiot and that the gashes would scar. I told her I was aware of both facts. 20 minutes later, as she was sealing the last wound on my forearm, a Velari royal guard appeared in the corridor. The guard was enormous, armored in ceremonial plate that shimmered with the same bronze tones as the Queen's chiton. It spoke in formal court dialect that my translator processed with precise clarity. Queen Salith requested a private audience with the human candidate. The medical officer stopped what she was doing and stared at me. I stared at the guard. The guard waited with the patience of something carved from stone. No other candidate had received a private audience, not Vorthek, not Aelendor, not Kravith, no one. I followed the guard through corridors of living coral, each one more ornate than the last, until we reached a chamber deep within the palace that felt less like a room and more like the inside of a living jewel. The walls pulsed with soft amber light that matched the color of the Queen's eyes. Queen Salith was there, alone, no guards, no attendants, no courtiers, just her, standing near a wide window that looked out over the glowing cityscape of the Velari capital. She turned when I entered, and I was struck again by the sheer presence of her. 7 feet of armored grace, those 4 amber eyes studying me with an intensity that made me feel like every cell in my body was being catalogued. She spoke. Her voice was different in this small space, less ceremonial, more direct. Why did you not bring a weapon worthy of the fight? I looked at her and told her the truth, because lying to a being who ruled 1,000 worlds seemed like a poor strategy. That was my only weapon. She was silent for a very long time. The amber light pulsed slowly around us, and the city beyond the window hummed with the sounds of a civilization that had existed since before my species learned to use fire. Then she spoke again, and what she said was not a question. It was a statement, delivered with a certainty that left no room for argument. You fought a creature designed to kill armored warriors, and you did it with a knife that costs less than the meal I ate this morning, and you won. I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. She stepped closer. Not threatening, not intimate, just closer, as if she wanted to see me more clearly. Your species is very young, she said. Your empire is very small. You have no wealth, no ancient power, no genetic legacy that would make you valuable in the traditional sense of this selection. All of those things were true, and I told her so. She tilted her head in that way I remembered from the first ceremony. Her mandibles clicked softly, processing something I could not see. "And yet you are still standing," she said. "Every candidate in this selection has been given every advantage their civilization can provide. You have been given nothing, and you are still standing." I told her that standing was something humans were good at. We did not always stand gracefully, and we did not always stand wisely, but we stood. She watched me for another long moment, and then she said something my translator struggled with, because the concept did not map cleanly to any human language. The closest approximation was this: "You interest me, Dax Corwin, and that is a very rare thing." Then she dismissed me, and I walked back to the embassy on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, knowing that something fundamental had shifted in the hall that day. I just did not know yet how far the ground was going to move. The next morning, I woke up in a different world. Not literally, but the change was unmistakable. I walked from the embassy to the palace complex the same way I had every day for the past 6 months. Through the same streets, past the same Velari merchants, and the same alien traffic. But the way they looked at me had changed. Word had traveled fast. In a civilization built on gossip and political maneuvering, the fact that Queen Salith had granted a private audience to the human candidate was the most significant piece of news to come out of the selection so far. More significant than Vorthek's 8-second kill. More significant than Kravith breaking a war beast with his bare hands. Because those were displays of power, and the Velari had seen power before. A queen summoning a candidate to her private chambers was something else entirely. I could feel it in the corridors of the palace. Delegates who had ignored me the day before now tracked me with watchful eyes. Candidates who had dismissed me as a joke now gave me cautious nods as I passed. And the ones who did not nod looked at me with something colder than dismissal. The Drashan delegation had closed ranks. Their section of the palace guest quarters had doubled its security overnight, and Prince Vorthek had been seen in extended private meetings with the Gorvathi warlord Kravith. 2 of the 3 largest military powers in the quadrant were talking to each other, and the only thing they had in common was that neither of them wanted a human anywhere near the Velari throne. I filed all of this in my daily report to Ambassador Prescott, and tried not to think about what it meant. The 3rd trial was announced at midday, the trial of mind. Each candidate would be presented with a simulated galactic crisis, and given a limited time to develop and present a strategic response. The Queen and her council would evaluate each response based on creativity, practicality, and what the Velari called Seveth, a concept that translated roughly as wisdom under pressure. The simulation was the same for every candidate. A colony world at the intersection of 3 territorial borders was experiencing catastrophic environmental collapse. A refugee fleet of 2 million civilians was stranded in orbit with failing life support. A border war had erupted between 2 neighboring powers over the colony's remaining resources, and the candidate had exactly the military and diplomatic assets currently available to the Velari Dominion to resolve the situation. It was an impossible problem. That was the point. Prince Vorthek went first. His approach was military. He proposed deploying the Dominion's 3rd Fleet to establish a blockade around the colony, forcing both warring factions to cease hostilities or face Velari firepower. The refugee fleet would be escorted to Velari territory and processed through standard asylum protocols. The colony's resources would be claimed by the Dominion as compensation for military intervention. It was clean, decisive, and aggressive. The Drashan delegation approved audibly. The solution saved the refugees and ended the war. But it did so by making the Dominion the dominant power in the region, and turning both warring factions into resentful subjects. It was a solution that created 3 new problems for everyone it solved. Prince Aelendor's approach was diplomatic. He proposed a multilateral conference bringing both warring factions, the refugee population, and neutral observers to the table. A resource-sharing agreement would be brokered that gave each faction proportional access to the colony's remaining assets. The refugees would be distributed across multiple receiving nations to minimize the burden on any single civilization. It was elegant, thoughtful, and would take approximately 6 months to implement. The refugees had 3 weeks of life support remaining. Warlord Kravith did not bother with the colony. He proposed evacuating the resources, abandoning the planet, and letting the 2 warring factions destroy each other while the Dominion relocated the refugees to a Gorvathi labor colony where they would be put to productive use. When a Velari counselor pointed out that this was not a humanitarian solution, Kravith said that humanitarian was not a Gorvathi word. Candidate after candidate presented their strategies: military solutions, diplomatic solutions, economic solutions, each one sophisticated, each one reflecting the philosophical priorities of the civilization that produced the candidate. And each one, I noticed, treated the refugee population as a logistical problem to be managed, rather than as 2 million individuals who were running out of air. Then it was my turn. I stood before the strategic display, which projected a three-dimensional map of the crisis zone, and I looked at the problem the way I had been trained to look at problems since I was 16 years old and everything was on fire. I started with the refugees. Not the border war, not the resources, not the political implications. The refugees. 2 million people with 3 weeks of air. Everything else was secondary. I proposed using the refugee fleet's own vessels as the evacuation platform. The ships were stranded, but they were not destroyed. With emergency engineering support from the Dominion, their life support could be extended by cannibalizing non-essential systems. That bought time. Next, the border war. Both factions were fighting over the colony's mineral resources, but the colony was in environmental collapse. Within a year, the resources would be inaccessible, regardless of who controlled the surface. I proposed presenting both factions with this reality and offering them a deal. The Dominion would provide orbital extraction technology capable of mining the resources before the collapse made them unreachable. In exchange, both factions would agree to a temporary ceasefire and a three-way split of the extracted materials. Each faction got something, the Dominion got something, and the war ended not because someone won it, but because fighting it became economically irrational. The refugees would then be relocated, using the freed-up military transport capacity from both factions, since their warships were no longer needed on the border. Each faction would receive refugee populations proportional to their resource share, providing labor for the mining operations. It was not elegant, it was not powerful, it was not the kind of solution that made empires tremble or philosophers nod in approval. It was practical, it was fast, and it treated 2 million stranded people as the first priority rather than the last. I finished my presentation and stepped back. The hall was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the laughter after the trial of lineage. I could see delegates in the galleries leaning toward each other, speaking in low voices. Several Velari counselors were reviewing the strategic projections I had outlined, running the numbers. Queen Salith had not moved throughout my presentation. Her 4 amber eyes had been locked on me the entire time, not on the strategic display, not on the projections. On me, as if the solution itself mattered less than the mind that produced it. I returned to my position in the candidate line and waited. The trial of mind concluded without formal ranking. Like the trial of lineage, it was an evaluation round. The Queen and her council would weigh each response as part of their overall assessment. That evening, I walked back to the embassy through the twilight streets of the capital. The bioluminescent architecture was particularly beautiful at dusk, the buildings shifting through slow waves of blue and violet as the city's biological rhythms transitioned from day cycle to night cycle. I did not see them coming. The first blow caught me in the kidneys from behind and dropped me to my knees. The second came from the side, a heavy impact to my ribs that sent me sprawling across the smooth pavement. I rolled instinctively and got my arms up just in time to block a third strike aimed at my head. There were 4 of them. They wore unmarked clothing and face coverings, but their body structure was unmistakable. Gorvathi, broad, heavy, built for impact. They moved with trained coordination, surrounding me in a loose semicircle that cut off every escape route. They were not trying to kill me. I realized that in the first few seconds. They were trying to hurt me badly enough that I would be unable to compete in the remaining trials. Or they were trying to make me flee, to create the appearance that the human candidate had abandoned the selection in cowardice. I did not flee. The fight was ugly, graceless, and short. Street combat always is. I broke the nose of the first one with an elbow strike that used his own forward momentum against him. The second grabbed me from behind, and I drove my head backward into his face, hard enough to feel cartilage give way. The third one got in a solid hit to my jaw that made the world go white for a half second. and I responded with a knee to his midsection that folded him like paper. The fourth one was smarter. He hung back, waited for me to engage his companions, and then hit me from my blind side with something heavy. It connected with my left side just below the ribs, and I felt something shift in a way that meant cracked. The pain was extraordinary, the kind that makes your vision narrow and your legs forget how to work. I went down. But I grabbed his ankle on the way and pulled him down with me, and from the ground I was in my element. Grappling was not pretty, but it was effective, and I had been in enough bar fights and combat situations to know how to fight from my back. I hyperextended his elbow joint until he screamed and released his weapon, then I rolled free and came up on my feet. They ran, all four of them, disappearing into the twilight streets of the capital with a speed that suggested professional training and a planned escape route. I stood alone on the empty pavement, breathing hard, my left side burning and my jaw already swelling. I walked back to the embassy under my own power. Again. The medical officer treated me again. She did not call me an idiot this time. She just looked at my injuries with the grim efficiency of someone who was beginning to understand that this was going to keep happening. 2 cracked ribs, deep bruising along my left flank, a hairline fracture in my jaw. Nothing life-threatening, everything painful. Ambassador Prescott wanted to file a formal protest with the Velari court. I talked her out of it. We had no proof the attackers were Gorvathi. We had no proof they were connected to Warlord Kravith or any other candidate. Filing an accusation without evidence would make us look paranoid and weak, which was exactly what the attack was designed to accomplish. So I said nothing. I went back to my quarters, lay down on my bunk, and stared at the ceiling, while my cracked ribs reminded me with every breath that I was a very long way from home. And I thought about Queen Salith. Not in the way the other candidates thought about her. They thought about power, they thought about alliance. They thought about what the Velari Dominion could give them, and what they could take from it. Every candidate in that hall was running a calculation, measuring the value of the throne against the cost of standing beside it. I thought about her eyes, 4 of them, amber and burning, carrying the weight of 1,000 worlds, and the expectations of a civilization that had existed for millennia. I thought about the way she sat on that throne, perfectly still, perfectly composed, watching 63 candidates present themselves like goods at a market, while the fate of her empire hung on which one she pointed to. No one in that hall had looked at her like a person. They had looked at her like a prize, like a strategic asset, like the most valuable piece on a board they were all trying to control. And I realized, lying on my bunk with my ribs screaming, that something had changed in me. I was not competing in this selection because I was trapped by diplomatic protocol. I was not doing this because my ambassador ordered me to survive it. I was doing this because Queen Salith of the Velari Dominion was the loneliest being I had ever seen, and every candidate in that hall was too busy coveting her crown to notice. The 4th trial was announced 2 days later, giving my ribs just enough time to graduate from agonizing to merely excruciating. The trial of sacrifice. Each candidate would stand before the queen and declare what they would give, what they would sacrifice to become her consort. This was the trial that mattered. The Velari valued sacrifice above all other qualities. Their entire civilization was built on the principle that leadership required personal cost, that power without sacrifice was tyranny. The consort, who stood beside the queen, was expected to give up something real, something meaningful, something that proved their commitment was not just words. The candidates had prepared for this. I could tell by the way they carried themselves as they entered the hall. They had rehearsed their offerings, calculated their sacrifices, workshopped their speeches. This was the performance that would determine their ranking going into the final trial. Prince Vorthek went first. He offered a military alliance, the full might of the Drashan Empire, pledged to the defense of the Velari Dominion, conditional on his selection as consort. It was an enormous offer. 12 battle fleets, thousands of warships, a military partnership that would make the combined force the most powerful in the quadrant. Conditional. The word hung in the air like smoke. Conditional, meaning it came with strings, meaning it was not a sacrifice, it was a transaction. Prince Aelendor offered the Solmari knowledge archives, the accumulated intellectual wealth of a civilization 10,000 years old, open to Velari scholars without restriction. It was generous. It was impressive. And it was, again, conditional on his selection. Warlord Kravith offered territory, 3 star systems on the Gorvathi border, ceded to the Dominion as a permanent buffer zone, valuable, strategic, and purchased with the lives of the populations who already lived there, though Kravith did not mention that part. Candidate after candidate presented their offerings: wealth, technology, resources, political alliances, military support. Each one larger than the last, each one more elaborate, each one wrapped in diplomatic language that could not quite hide the fact that every single offering was a business proposal, disguised as devotion. Then it was my turn, and I walked to the center of the floor with absolutely nothing to offer. I told the hall the truth. I had no fleet to pledge. I had no empire to share. I had no ancient knowledge, no conquered territory, no genetic legacy worth a fraction of what any other candidate had presented. My species was 11 years into its galactic existence. Our total military strength would not fill one wing of the Drashan Armada. Our wealth was laughable by the standards of this room. The only thing I had was myself. I said that a consort's duty was not to bring power to the throne. It was to stand beside the person who sat on it. To be there when the crown was too heavy, and the decisions were too hard, and the loneliness of absolute authority became unbearable. I said that every offering presented today had been conditional, attached to the outcome of the selection, given only if the giver received something in return. I told Queen Salith that I had nothing conditional to give. I could only offer myself, without reservation, without political calculation, without expectation of return, not because I was noble or selfless, but because I genuinely had nothing else. I stepped back. The silence in the hall was different this time. It was not the silence of laughter waiting to happen, or the silence of polite confusion. It was the silence of 4,000 beings who had just heard something they did not know how to categorize. Queen Salith rose from her throne. She had not stood during any trial. She had not moved from her seat through dozens of presentations, hundreds of declarations, hours of ceremony. She had received everything from a position of absolute stillness. Now she stood, and the hall caught its breath. She did not speak. She did not need to. The act of standing was a statement so powerful that the political implications began rippling outward before she had even settled to her full height. I returned to my position in the candidate line. My heart was hammering against my cracked ribs, and I could feel the eyes of every candidate in the hall burning into my back. That evening, the Drashan ambassador requested an emergency session with the Velari court. I was not present, but Ambassador Prescott had sources, and within 2 hours, I knew what had happened. The Drashan Empire had delivered a formal ultimatum. If a human was selected as the Queen's consort, the Drashan Empire would consider it a deliberate and calculated insult to the Drashan people, their candidate, and their civilization. All treaties between the Drashan Empire and the Velari Dominion would be immediately suspended. Military cooperation would cease. Trade routes would be closed. The Gorvathi hegemony seconded the ultimatum within the hour. Same terms, same consequences. 2 of the 3 largest military powers in the quadrant, representing a combined fleet of over 5,000 warships, had just told the Velari Dominion that choosing me would be an act of war. Ambassador Prescott sat across from me in the embassy conference room and laid out the situation with the clinical precision of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. If the Queen chose me and the Drashan and Gorvathi followed through on their ultimatums, the Velari Dominion would face a 2-front military threat from adversaries, whose combined strength was nearly equal to their own. War was not guaranteed, but the possibility was real, and even the possibility would destabilize the entire quadrant. If the Queen chose me, and the ultimatums were bluffs, the diplomatic fallout would still be severe. Decades of alliance building, undone. Trade networks, disrupted. The Dominion's political influence, damaged. Prescott told me she had received orders from Earth, direct orders, from people whose authority I could not question, and whose judgment I was not permitted to override. Under no circumstances are you to jeopardize humanity's galactic standing. Withdraw from the selection immediately. That is a direct order. I sat in that conference room for a very long time after she left. I went to see the Queen one last time. Not as a candidate, not as a suitor. I went as a soldier delivering a briefing, because that was what I was, and that was what she needed. The royal guard admitted me to her private chambers without question. I did not know whether that was protocol or whether Salith had left standing orders regarding my access. Either way, the door opened, and I walked into that amber-lit room and found her standing by the window again, looking out over the capital, with an expression that I could finally read after weeks of studying Veilari facial cues. She was tired, not physically. The kind of tired that comes from carrying decisions that affect billions of lives and having no one to share the weight with. I told her everything. The assassination attempt, the coordinated pressure from the Drashan and Gorvathi delegations, the ultimatums, the pattern I had observed across the entire selection, the way the two empires had been working together from the beginning to ensure that one of their candidates occupied the consort position. I laid it out the way I would lay out a tactical assessment for a commanding officer, clear and direct and without diplomatic softening. I told her that the selection was not just a ceremony. It was a political operation designed to install a puppet beside her throne. Whoever she chose from the Drashan or Gorvathi candidates would spend the rest of their time as consort feeding intelligence, influence, and leverage back to their home empire. Within a generation, the Veilari Dominion's independence would be compromised beyond recovery. She listened without interrupting. Her 4 eyes watched me with that burning amber intensity, and I could feel the weight of her attention like sunlight through a magnifying glass. When I finished, I told her the last part. The part that mattered. I said that I had been ordered to withdraw. My government had made its decision, and I was a soldier who followed orders. I was going to comply. I said that I wanted her to know what she was walking into before I left. Not because it changed anything, not because I thought my warning would alter the outcome, but because she deserved to know. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. The amber light pulsed around us, and the city below hummed with the lives of millions of beings who depended on the choices she made. Then she spoke, and her voice was different than any other time I had heard it. Not the ceremonial voice of the choosing hall, not the analytical voice of the private audience. Something rawer, something closer to the person underneath the crown. And if I do not wish you to withdraw, I told her that my wishes did not matter. My government had ordered me out. Her eyes burned brighter. I would have sworn the amber light in the room intensified. Your government did not enter the trials. You did. I opened my mouth to explain the chain of command, the diplomatic implications, the military realities. I wanted to tell her that one human's defiance was not worth the consequences, that humanity could not afford the political cost, that I was not important enough to risk everything my species had built in 11 years of galactic participation. But she stepped closer, and the words died in my throat. She said something in formal Veilari that my translator processed with unusual care, as if the software itself understood the significance of the words. In 300 years of rule, I have never asked anyone to stay. I am asking you. I left her chambers. I walked back to the embassy in the dark. I sat on my bunk, and I stared at the wall, and I thought about duty, about orders, about the difference between what I was told to do and what I knew was right. The Drashan and Gorvathi empires were going to absorb the Veilari Dominion, not through war, through a consort who would sit beside the queen and slowly, methodically, dismantle her authority from the inside. It would take years, maybe decades, but it would happen, because that was what empires did. They consumed. My orders were clear. Withdraw. Protect humanity's position. Do not risk our fragile standing in the galactic community for one selection ceremony on one alien world. And Queen Salith, the most powerful individual I had ever met, who ruled 1,000 worlds and commanded fleets that could darken stars, had looked at me and said, I am asking you. Not commanding. Asking. The final trial was the next morning, the trial of truth, the most sacred tradition in the entire selection process. Each candidate would stand before the queen and speak one absolute truth about themselves. Not a political truth, Not a strategic truth. A real one. And the queen would know if they lied, because Velari queens possessed an empathic biological ability that could detect deception at a cellular level. No candidate in the history of the trials had ever successfully lied during the trial of truth. I was supposed to be gone by then. My withdrawal was supposed to be filed before dawn. Ambassador Prescott had the paperwork ready. Earth was expecting confirmation. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my bunk, and I listened to the sounds of an alien city settling into darkness, and I made the hardest decision of my life. When the sun rose over Sithari Prime, I put on my borrowed uniform. I straightened the collar. I checked my reflection in the small mirror above the sink. The face looking back at me was bruised, scarred, exhausted, and absolutely certain. I walked to the palace. The great choosing hall was packed for the final trial. Every seat in the galleries was filled. The delegations were in their finest ceremonial attire. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The candidates assembled in the crescent. I was not among them. My position at the end of the line was empty. The Drashan delegation noticed immediately, and a murmur of satisfaction rippled through their section. The human had withdrawn. The nuisance had been dealt with. Prince Vorthek stepped forward for the trial of truth. He stood before Queen Salith and spoke his truth. He said that he would be a loyal and dutiful consort, that the Drashan Empire would be honored by the Union, that he would serve the Dominion with the same dedication he had served his own people. All true. My translator confirmed it by the absence of any deception indicators from the Queen's response. All technically, carefully, precisely true, and all absolutely empty. The truth of a diplomat who had practiced sincerity until it was indistinguishable from performance. Prince Aelendor spoke next. His truth was that he admired the Queen and believed their union would create a golden age of intellectual and cultural advancement for both civilizations. True, calculated, hollow. Warlord Kravith stood before the throne and said that he respected strength, that the Queen possessed strength, and that their combined strength would be unmatched. True, brutal, transactional. Candidate after candidate delivered their truths, each one technically honest, each one carefully constructed to reveal nothing real while appearing to reveal everything. They were performing authenticity, and they were performing it well. The last candidate finished. The high priest stepped forward to begin the closing ceremony. I walked into the hall. The sound that went through the galleries was something between a gasp and a roar. 4,000 beings reacting simultaneously to the appearance of a man who was not supposed to be there. The Drashan delegation shot to their feet. Warlord Kravith's hand went to the ceremonial blade at his hip. Ambassador Prescott, somewhere in the gallery above me, made a sound that my translator mercifully did not process. I walked across the floor, past the candidate crescent, past the towering figures of princes and warlords and philosopher kings, who stared at me with expressions ranging from fury to disbelief. I stopped before the throne. Queen Salith looked down at me. Her 4 amber eyes were blazing, not with anger, not with surprise, with something I had never seen from her before. Hope. I spoke my truth, and because it was the trial of truth, and because a Velari queen could hear lies the way humans could hear music, I did not dress it up. I did not calculate it. I did not practice it in front of a mirror or run it past a diplomatic advisor. I told her I was afraid. I said that I had spent my entire life fighting. From the moment those raiders hit my colony when I was 16, I had been in survival mode. Fighting, enduring, adapting, refusing to stay down. It was the only thing I knew how to do. I was good at it. I was so good at it that I had built my entire identity around the ability to take punishment and keep standing. But this was different. For the first time in my life, I had found something I did not want to just survive. I wanted to be worthy of it, and I was terrified that I was not. I said that I was standing in this hall in direct violation of orders from my own government. My career was over. I would probably face a military tribunal when I got home. Everything I had worked for since the day I picked up that piece of hull plating was gone. And I was here anyway, because she asked me to stay, and I could not think of a single thing in my life that had ever mattered more than that. The hall was so quiet I could hear the coral walls breathing. Queen Salith descended from her throne. She had never done this. In the entire recorded history of the selection, no queen had ever left the throne during the trials. The throne was sacred. The throne was absolute. The queen received. She did not approach. Salith walked down the steps of the throne platform with a deliberate grace that made every step feel like a declaration. She crossed the floor. She passed Prince Vorthek, who stood frozen. She passed Prince Aelendor, whose legendary composure had cracked for the first time. She passed Warlord Kraveth, whose hand had fallen away from his blade. She stopped in front of me. I looked up at her. 7 feet of bronze chitin and amber fire, and the weight of 1,000 worlds. She extended her hand. Palm up, fingers spread. The Velari gesture of chosen bonding. The gesture a queen used once in her lifetime to select the being who would stand beside her for the rest of her reign. The meaning was unmistakable. The hall erupted. The sound was deafening. 4,000 voices from dozens of species, all reacting at once to the most shocking moment in 3 centuries of Velari political history. The Drashan delegation was on its feet screaming. Ambassador Vorthen, the senior Drashan diplomat, was shouting demands at the Velari high priest, so loudly, his translator was distorting. The Gorvathi delegation had gone silent, in the way that large predatory things go silent before they attack, and Warlord Kraveth was staring at me with an expression that promised violence. I barely heard any of it. I was looking at the Queen's hand, extended toward me, palm up, and I was thinking about a 16-year-old farm boy in a burning shed, holding a piece of sharp metal, and I was thinking about how far I had come, and I was thinking that the universe was either incredibly kind or incredibly cruel, and I could not tell which. I took her hand. The texture of her chitin was smooth and warm, not cold like I had expected. Her fingers closed around mine with a precision that communicated both tenderness and strength, and the moment our hands connected, a low harmonic tone resonated through the hall, generated by the living coral walls in response to the bonding gesture. It was the building itself acknowledging the Queen's choice. The political explosion continued around us. The Drashan ambassador had physically crossed the diplomatic boundary line and was confronting the Velari high priest in a display of aggression that would have been considered an act of war under normal circumstances. The Gorvathi delegation had begun a rhythmic chant that my translator identified as a formal declaration of grievance. Prince Vorthek stepped forward. His voice cut through the chaos with the trained projection of a warrior who had commanded armies. He invoked the claim of blood. The hall went silent. Not the gradual settling silence of a crowd calming down. The immediate, violent silence of 4,000 beings, simultaneously recognizing that something terrible had just been set in motion. The claim of blood was an ancient Velari rite, older than the current dynasty, older than the choosing hall itself. It allowed any candidate to challenge the Queen's chosen consort to single combat. If the challenger won, the selection was voided and the process began again. It had not been invoked in over 500 years, because the last time it happened, the challenger had killed the chosen consort on the floor of the hall, and the resulting political crisis had nearly destroyed the Dominion. Vorthek stood in the center of the floor, his obsidian exoskeleton gleaming under the bioluminescent light, and he looked at me with 6 eyes that held no hatred, no anger, just the cold calculation of a predator that had identified its prey. He said that the ancient laws were clear. The claim could not be refused. The combat would take place immediately, and one of us would not walk out of the hall. Queen Salith's hand tightened on mine. I could feel the tension in her grip, the controlled fury of a ruler whose authority was being challenged through the letter of her own laws. She spoke to Vorthek in formal court dialect. She told him that invoking the claim was within his right, but would be remembered by history. He told her that history was written by the victorious. I let go of the Queen's hand. I turned to face Prince Vorthek of the Drashan Empire, who was 8 feet tall and built for war, who had been genetically enhanced since birth, who carried a plasma lance capable of burning through starship armor, who had personally killed more enemies in combat than I had met people in my entire life. I told him I accepted. The hall was cleared for combat. The galleries remained packed, but the floor was emptied of everyone except Vorthek and me. The containment fields activated, sealing the combat space. The same fields that had kept the Rethkai war beast contained. now hummed around the perimeter, and I tried not to think about the implication of that comparison. ThHFY stood at one end of the floor. He had removed his ceremonial outer plating to reveal the combat armor beneath, a form-fitting system of interlocking plates that covered every joint and vital point. His plasma lance was active, its blade end glowing with contained energy that distorted the air around it. He moved through a series of warm-up forms that demonstrated speed, precision, and the casual lethality of someone who had trained for combat since before my species had discovered radio waves. I stood at the other end. I had my knife, the same knife I had used against the ThHFY. The medical officer had given me a stimulant injection to manage the pain from my still-healing ribs, but she had warned me it would wear off in about 20 minutes. After that, every impact would be felt at full intensity. I also had something ThHFY did not. I had fought on colony worlds where the air tried to poison you, and the ground tried to eat you, and the wildlife treated humans as a food group. I had been in combat situations where the enemy outnumbered us 10 to 1, and our equipment was failing, and the extraction shuttle was 3 hours late. I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing in any fight was not the enemy's strength. It was your own willingness to quit. And I did not quit. I did not know how. ThHFY attacked. He was fast, faster than anything his size should have been. The plasma lance swept toward me in an arc that would have bisected me at the waist if I had been standing still. I was not standing still. I threw myself sideways, felt the heat of the energy blade pass close enough to singe the hair on my arm, and rolled across the stone floor. He followed immediately. No pause, no reset. The lance came down in a vertical strike that cracked the floor where I had been a half-second earlier. I scrambled backward, using the broken stone as cover, and felt a sharp pain in my side as my ribs protested the movement. ThHFY was not just fast. He was technical. Every strike was part of a sequence, each one designed to drive me into a position where the next one would be unavoidable. He had been trained in combat systems that had been refined over 12,000 years, and he executed them with the mechanical precision of a being that had never needed to improvise. That was his weakness. He did not improvise. He did not need to. Everything in his life had been structured, optimized, controlled. He had never fought something unpredictable, because unpredictable things did not survive long enough to fight a Drashan prince. I stopped retreating. I stopped trying to avoid his sequences. Instead, I did something that made no tactical sense at all. I charged directly into his next strike. The plasma lance caught me across the left shoulder. The energy blade did not cut deep. My angle was wrong for a full impact, but it burned. The pain was beyond anything I had felt before. A white-hot line of agony that reached from my shoulder to my fingertips. I screamed. I heard it echo through the hall, but I was inside his reach now, too close for the lance to be effective, and I drove my knife into the gap between his chest plates with everything I had. ThHFY roared. The sound shook the containment fields. He brought a massive elbow down on my back, and I felt something crack, either a rib or the pavement, and for a moment, I was on the ground with the world going gray at the edges. I got up. He hit me again. A backhand sweep that caught the side of my head and sent me spinning. Blood filled my mouth. My vision doubled. I stumbled, caught myself on a piece of broken floor, and got up. He hit me again. A kick to my injured ribs that lifted me off my feet and sent me crashing into the containment field. The energy barrier caught me, held me for a sickening moment, and dumped me on the floor. Every nerve in my body was firing at maximum. The stimulant was wearing off, and the full weight of every injury was crashing down on me at once. I got up. ThHFY stared at me. For the first time in the fight, his composure cracked. Not because I was threatening him. I was barely standing. My left arm was burned and half-usable. My ribs were beyond cracked. I was bleeding from my mouth, my scalp, and a dozen minor cuts. By every measurable standard, I was defeated. But I was standing, and he was beginning to understand that standing was something I did not stop doing. He came at me again, faster this time, angrier. The precision of his earlier attacks was degrading as frustration crept into his movements. He swung the plasma lance in wider arcs, putting power behind the strikes instead of technique. Each one was more dangerous, but also more predictable. I let him chase me. I absorbed the impacts I could not avoid, and dodged the ones I could. I watched his patterns change as his frustration grew, and I waited. The opening came on his seventh strike. He overextended on a sweeping horizontal arc, his body rotating past the point of easy recovery. For 1/3 of a second, his left side was exposed. The gap between his shoulder plate and his neck guard was visible. I threw my knife. It was not a technique I had learned in military training. It was a skill I had picked up on colony worlds, throwing sharpened metal at things that needed to stop moving. The knife covered the distance between us in a fraction of a second and buried itself in the gap between Vorthic's shoulder and neck armor. He staggered, the lance dipped, and I hit him. I threw every remaining ounce of strength into a tackle that caught him mid-stumble. We went down together, 8 feet of armored Drashan prince and 1 bleeding, broken human. On the ground, his advantages disappeared. The lance was too long to use effectively. His size made him slower to recover position, and I had spent my military career learning how to fight from the worst possible position, because that was where humans usually ended up. I got behind him. I locked my arms around his neck, finding the vulnerability in the exoskeleton plating that protected the airway. I squeezed. He thrashed. His 4 arms reached for me, clawed at me, tried to pry me loose. One of them caught my burned shoulder, and the pain was so intense that my vision went completely white for 2 full seconds. I did not let go. He bucked, rolled, slammed me against the floor. I held on. He drove backward into the containment field, crushing me between his armored back and the energy barrier. I held on. He reached over his shoulder and grabbed my head, trying to pull me free by force. I held on. It took 90 seconds. 90 seconds of the most brutal, desperate physical contest I had ever experienced. 90 seconds of a Drashan prince, the finest warrior his empire had produced, fighting with everything he had against a human who had no advantages except one. I refused to let go. Vorthic's movements slowed, his arms dropped, his body went slack, and then, in a voice that my translator rendered with perfect clarity, he spoke a single word. Yield. I released him. He collapsed to the floor, gasping, beaten not by superior strength or superior technology, but by something his 12,000-year warrior culture had never encountered in such raw, undiluted form. The absolute, unreasonable, biologically incomprehensible human refusal to stop. I stood up. It took me 3 tries. My body was a catalog of injuries that would keep the medical officer busy for days, but I stood. The hall was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then, it broke. The Drashan delegation sat down, slowly, heavily, with the stunned compliance of beings who had just watched their finest champion defeated by a creature they had dismissed as irrelevant. The Gorvathi delegation withdrew their ultimatum before the dust had settled, because they had seen what had just happened, and they understood its implications. The rest of the gallery erupted into chaos, dozens of species all processing the same impossible reality. The human won. Queen Salith descended from her position above the combat floor. She walked through the containment field, which deactivated at her approach, and crossed the arena to where I was standing on legs that felt like they were made of something less reliable than bone. She looked at me. I looked at her. We were both a mess, in different ways, but in that moment, I think we understood each other more clearly than we had at any point during the entire selection. She turned to face the hall. 4,000 beings held their breath. She spoke in formal court dialect, her voice amplified by the living architecture, until it filled every corner of that ancient space. She said that she had chosen her consort. She said that the trials had revealed what she needed to see. Not strength, not wealth, not lineage, but character. Every candidate had shown her what they could give her: resources, alliances, military power, intellectual prestige. Each one had presented a transaction. One candidate had shown her who he was, not what he owned, not what he controlled, not what he could trade for the privilege of standing beside her throne. Who he was. A man who fought with what he had, because it was all he had. Who prioritized the lives of strangers over the mechanics of power. Who offered himself without condition, because he had nothing else to offer, who walked into a hall full of giants and refused to be anything less than exactly what he was. She named me Dax Corwin, consort to the Queen of the Velari Dominion. The political aftermath was a landslide. Within hours, the Drashan Empire quietly rescinded its ultimatum. Not publicly. They did not have the political capital for a public reversal. But through back channels, through diplomatic whispers, the message was clear. They were backing down. Not because they respected humanity, not because they had suddenly discovered a sense of fair play. Because they were afraid. They had watched a human with no enhancements, no advanced weapons, and no political backing absorb enough punishment to kill most species and then win through sheer biological stubbornness. And they had run the calculation that every military strategist in the quadrant was now running. If one human could do that, what could a billion of them do? The Gorvathi hegemony reached the same conclusion faster. Warlord Kravith sent a personal message to our embassy, acknowledging the combat result with what my translator identified as grudging respect. It was the closest thing to a compliment Gorvathi culture was capable of producing. Earth's response evolved in stages. The initial reaction was panic. I had disobeyed a direct order. My career was, technically, over. The diplomatic corps was preparing damage control protocols and worst-case contingency plans. Then the implications landed. The consort of the Velari Queen was human. Humanity now had a direct, personal, unbreakable connection to the most powerful empire in the quadrant. Not through negotiation, not through military posturing, not through economic leverage, through something the galactic community had never seen before from a species as young as ours. A human had been chosen, not because of what humanity could offer, but because of what one human was. Ambassador Prescott contacted me the evening after the selection was formalized. Her tone had changed considerably since our last conversation. She did not mention the direct order I had violated. She did not mention asteroid mineral surveys. She told me that Earth was very proud of me and that my military tribunal had been quietly cancelled. I thanked her and went back to the royal palace, where the preparations for the bonding ceremony were already underway. That night, I stood on the balcony of the Queen's private chambers and looked out over the alien skyline of Sithari Prime. The bioluminescent buildings painted the sky in waves of blue and gold, and the air smelled like ozone and flowers, and the distant hum of a civilization that had existed since before my ancestors learned to plant seeds. Salith joined me on the balcony. She stood beside me, 7 feet of bronze chitin and amber eyes, and for a long time neither of us spoke. We just looked out at the city and breathed the same air and existed in the same moment. Then she asked me if I regretted my choice. I looked at her, this towering, terrifying, magnificent queen, who had looked at a hall full of the most powerful beings in the galaxy and chosen the one with the borrowed uniform and the 8-inch knife. I looked at her, and I told her the truth, because that was the only thing I had ever been able to give her. I told her I was still afraid. I told her I was not sure I was worthy of what she had given me. I told her that I had no idea how to be a consort to a queen who ruled 1,000 worlds. And I told her that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. She did not answer with words. She reached out and took my hand again, the same gesture that had changed everything in the hall, and her fingers closed around mine with that same combination of tenderness and strength. We stood there together, human and Velari, consort and queen, looking out at a galaxy that would never see either of us the same way again. They could keep their empires, their fleets, and their ancient bloodlines. I had something none of them understood. The stubbornness to stay standing when the universe told me to kneel.